seen that it's a little bit out there. And I'm really interested in having a little bit more structure around it and wondering if it's worth pursuing or if I want to take a different tack in thinking about salt and its connection, not necessarily with nutrition, but with other discourses of food and economy in this period, and indeed with building the nation and nationalism and thinking about modes of solidarity and collectivism in this period. Um, so what really struck me, so I've got to click that. So what really struck me as I looked at, well, as I looked at the call for papers and thought about what it is that I have to say about salt, and I'm guessing that Miles asked me to be part of this project or the workshop because I've been working on food for a while now, is, what this image over here, of Gandhi at Dandi taking the salt, and with this, the big quote with this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire, really thinking about with this image as a moment of food history has to do with these moments of food history. And to give you a little bit of background, because I know some of you, and I'm so excited to see Erica and to see Geraldine and other long lost friends here in the other this morning. And Riho, my sort of colleague in food history as well. What I've really been working on for the last 10 years is just spending a lot of time looking at advertising, looking at food discourses, looking at representations of the nation in relation to embodiment. And it just struck me that a lot of what happens in this picture, where Gandhi's taking up the salt and declaring it the basis for an embodied universality, is really, really different from how other contexts are taking up an embodied universality as a stand-in for the nation and as a way of bolstering these fledgling and emerging economies in the provinces. And so my challenge was really to think about, what this image has to do with these images. And so these images we're looking at are two ads for something called Vanaspati, better known as Dalda. No one ever knows what I mean when I say Vanaspati, but Dalda always resonates. The first is from, I think they're a little bit later, they're from 1937, but the first ad is really reminiscent of what we see coming out of the Vanaspati Hindustani Manufacturing Company very early on in the 1920s. And then the second ad is a little bit later for Dalda, but following along the same themes. And so it's blurry, but the big line there is Unko Shakti De Banaye, right? So like we will make a strong nation. And then you get this moment in the 50s where that changes a little bit into sort of a claim about motherhood and embodiment and care, which is of course the underpinning of how nationalist discourse emerges. And so, it just struck me that to think about this kind of image as something that so easily takes up food as like a food substance, as something that's just foregone in universalizing bodies and in universalizing sort of a singular struggle, is reductive in ways that are actually problematic. And so that's where this paper came from, with just feeling a kind of discomfort in thinking about the foregone conclusion that salt unifies. And so for me as a food historian, it's really clear that no food unifies in India in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And so much thought is put into thinking about how foods need to be regulated, the harms that food do, the harms that foods can do in the body, and most importantly, whose responsibility this all is. And so that's where I was coming from in thinking about this paper. And that's why it may sound a little bit strange in relation to all the others, which really do sort of treat the history of salt as a longitudinal process and as a really specific one in this moment. So I was thinking about like, what if we kind of displace salt itself as the center of the struggle? So to move on, I think, before and the other thing I want to do is really think about like this moment of protest as a singular event, rather than as one linked to the everyday attempts to forge a kind of nationalism in the subcontinent at this particular moment. And so I wanted to start by thinking about, why this protest matters, why this event matters. And we haven't had too many papers that deal with protest yet, but I know that it's a theme of the workshop. And so I'm really looking forward to how that develops as as a theme as well for all of you. So why does this moment matter? I think the most important thing that the SALT protest does is that it revives grand scale protest, right? If we think about, and this really comes from sort of 15 years, even almost 20 years of teaching South Asian history to folks who have no experience with it. And you kind of always have to teach Dandi as like this major moment, because I've just spent, the 10 years preceding it kind of thinking about like, the fallout of Chori Chora, like after the winds of Champaran, and the reconfiguration of Satyagraha and the formalization of the Congress and Purn Swaraj and all these other themes that have sort of formalized and professionalized the Congress in a way that it becomes in some ways very, very much less relevant to the teeming masses or the rural masses of India. And so this event matters the most because it is like the moment in the late 20s and the early 30s when everything is revived and all of a sudden there is this grand scale protest and it's very exciting. It also identifies in SALT an easy symbol for solidarity. And I think SALT can be displaced by a number of things in this moment. The idea is that, Gandhi does move to what Joseph Alter has, recognized as a really important biopolitics located in this notion of embodiment that Gandhi has always espoused, right? By centering brahmachari, by centering fasting. I know a lot of you, as I have spent a lot of time reading Gandhi's letters, and there is so much focus on, on diet, and Nico Slate's paper sort of delineated that really, really well. So I think, salt could have been a number of things. Dal could have been used instead of salt, but salt really provides this very sort of unique entry portal into thinking about how to sort of claim an embodied solidarity that's really legible. Also, I think what the moment does, in the same way that Jallianwala Bagh did, is it reveals the illiberalism of the Raj, evidenced by the excessive use of violence and force. And this is really about the darshan of salt protests, right? Where and like there's that brilliant scene in the movie Gandhi as well, where like you just see the protesters like banging on down with lathis, and it's very, very dramatic. And I'll tell you a funny story because it's just after 7 a.m. in Canada, but I teach that film, or a lot of it, almost every year in my survey class to undergraduates in Canada. And I'm so used to the film that I don't even clock the violence. But last year, my 6-year-old twins had a PED day. They had a day where they had to be home with me, but I had to teach, so they came along, and I was showing a little bit of Gandhi after doing a lecture on the Salt March and on the late 20s and early 30s leading up to the roundtables, and I started showing the film, and they were on their iPads watching Paw Patrol, but one of their iPads died, and so I looked over and kind of surveyed the crowd of students, and I see my then 5-year-old like watching the salt protests with tears streaming down his eyes, and he was terrified for like weeks after, and having dreams about protests and dreams about Gandhi, who he's heard a lot about. And so I think it's like there's a way that there's almost a galvanization of that moment of protest to really do this work of revealing violence in a way that's incredibly important after this period of time when the violence has been much more subdued. The Simon Commission is absolutely a violent undertaking, like the unwriting of Indians into the script of building responsible government in any form is absolutely a violent act, but it's not the same as beating down protesters who are protesting peacefully, being tended to by a coterie of women, right? Which is what which was what a lot of the papers have made a big sort of have put a lot of focus into, and what the literature puts focus into as well. But I think the most important thing about the Salt March, and this is also sort of borne out by the representation of it historically in different kinds of narratives, is that it's this major media event globally. And so all of these little things that resonate in the Indian context as new, kind of exceptional, a moment that's being revived in the world resonate as like this universal solidarity rooted in the Indian body. And for me, that feels really, really problematic, having studied bodies and how they're constructed and how they're subject to different forms of government and governmentality in this period for a couple of decades now. And so the outcomes, of course, are revived protest, and we see that sort of become a theme not only in India, but for others who march in the Gandhian vein, especially in England in the few years after. And I think, again, like Nico's work on, and other people's work on the connection to African-American activism, though of course, the connection there is much more with Dalit rights and Dalit movements, and eventually the Dalit Panthers and those connections. Like, I think there was something really inspirational about this moment, in part because it is such a global event. So the Revive protest, the Indian National Congress in the spotlight, of course, very interesting because, of course, the Congress was not that interested in the salt tax. And finally, of course, the roundtable talks. So we do see this moment get all these other processes started. Um, but for me, it feels really like a little bit off, as so easily connected to these other outcomes. And so for me, the challenge is in thinking about like, well, how do we narrativize this in slightly different ways? And I don't know if my ways are effective, but that's sort of the challenge I wanted to bring to the theme of the conference. And of course, like the big victory is that Gandhi becomes Times Man of the Year for 1930, which I didn't actually know until a couple of days ago when I was Googling images and found this one. So that's very exciting as well. It's not the only time he'll be the Man of the Year, but I think it's the first time that he was the Man of the Year because of the salt protests and because of where he's clearly headed. Okay, so what does my work do? So how what my work is trying to do is think about how this event doesn't fit. And the first thing that really comes to mind is that it belies the complexity of thinking about food economies in this period and thinking about the way in which the balance between imperial economy and local economies at the provincial level is starting to shift in really dynamic ways. And I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about the work that I've been doing for, oh my God, almost 7 or 8 years now on the history of vanaspati ghee and other food substances in this subcontinent. Because what's become really sort of clear to me is that, and this is followed from the work that I've done on Ayurveda, that I don't know how many of you have had a chance to engage it, but or if you will, but it's become really clear to me that diarchy, and this, luckily I'm very glad that it's also become clear to Stephen Legg, who's really sort of a renowned and wonderful scholar, and we can ride each other's coattails, but it's mostly me writing his. It's become really clear to me that, you know, the politics on the ground in the 20s are really, really interesting. And the notion of diarchy as this major failure is true for thinking about large-scale nationalism and large-scale political organization. But when you look at the provinces, daily life really does change. And so just to sort of recap what my book was trying to do, what I was really trying to do in terms of the history of Ayurveda, and this is something that happened in the archive rather than what I intended to see, was the way in which Ayurveda became instrumentalized and became governable as a system of medicine in the 20s and 30s, was because it was reformed in response to a clerical need. So the big sort of find for me in the archive and the crux of the book was that all of these new people in the expanded administration of the United Provinces were entitled to different kinds of leave, most notoriously sick leave. So you might have been, you know, the person who ran and got the files for the different politicians or the different clerks, but you still had the right to sick leave. And in order to get sick leave, you needed a medical certificate. And in order to get the medical certificate, you needed to find a doctor who would give it to you, but it was too expensive to go to a biomedical doctor. And so Vids and Hakims were given the responsibility of issuing medical certificates, but only if they had the right kind of training. So then the conversation becomes, what is the right kind of training and who certifies that? And so you have this sort of march along in the 20s and the 30s of Ayurveda and Unani into these governable categories, which does and doesn't change the internal context of the traditions, but in some ways brings them into step with what I think of as sort of a proto biopolitics of a biopolitics and also sort of a proto governmental system of managing public health. And so I've been coming to sort of all of these topics around food and embodiment with a similar sort of attention to what's changing on the ground in terms of governance. And food seems to be, to me, the other thing that's really changing, because all of a sudden, rather than having this conversation about food that's relegated to commodities that can be extracted and traded, like salt, there's these conversations on the ground that are in some ways a response to the expansion of governance to deal with the everyday, you know, of managing Indian life, right? So I think I still think like the Foucauldian way to think about things is the right way to think about things in the 20s. And what this means for something like vanaspati ghee is that rather than being, you know, vanaspati ghee is clarified vegetable oil. So it's sometimes made out of linseed. It's sometimes bolstered by things like sawdust or paraffin. And there's all this concern about it's being tainted. And rather than having this concern either entirely in sort of in popular domains or in private in ways that affect sort of bizarre economics, all of a sudden there are these legislative councils that you can approach, or that interested companies can approach. Mostly the companies who approach these provincial councils are really thinking about trying to cut off, the other company that are like the other manufacturer that are competing with them. But, but they do have this fora to go and ask their questions. And so what I've been doing for the last few years is really tracking what I'm calling the ghee debates as they develop in Punjab, in the United Provinces, and in Maharashtra, or I guess it's sort of in Bombay Presidency, and really thinking about the way in which like having a body that can like having a governmental body that can respond to what food does and how food harms is a really new idea. And the thing, and this is drawing from Ritu Birla's work, is that the economy works itself out way before the law does. And so this is another instance where, using the theoretical mode that Ritu does, I'm thinking about economy shaping the law, rather, not in a Marxist superstructure way, but really in thinking about, the legal apparatus responding to the way in which market economics are changing. So for me, food is a mode or a zone which is deeply, deeply contested in the 20s and 30s. Nothing about it is solid. And with Vanaspati ghee, we get this very, very interesting story because while it's in some ways a substance as old as salt in the subcontinent, in the sense that we have evidence, of it in the Susurtan Chaka Samhitas. Sometimes it's something to avoid, sometimes it's something to use. Along with ghee, it's got these kind of biomoral components because it is used as darshan or dan in puja. You have this thing that's got all this weight to it as a substance. It's not just a food, it's something more. In the same way that salt is not just a food, it's definitely something more. It is tied to sustenance in all these interesting historic ways and to economy. And so when you get to this moment where it's being legislated, you have all of this stuff to work out about what it also means and how that's going to be legible in the eyes of the law. And the interesting thing about Vanaspati is that it's not only an Indian debate, because the big investor in Vanaspati is actually a Dutch company called the Dada Corporation, and run by the Vandenberg family. And they try to get into the trade by extracting natural resources from East Africa or East African holdings there, and producing the stuff in the Netherlands and eventually in India. And so it becomes a sort of triangulated international or transnational trade. But the interesting thing about it is that because this is such a low level matter in terms of the imperial economy in India, the Raj doesn't really care. And so when the Vandenbergs try and go to appeal the Raj for all these permissions, they're kind of like, you have to deal with the provinces because we don't deal with these issues at the center. And so a trade agreement emerges between the province of Punjab and the Dada family. Later, Unilever gets in the game, and that's why it's called Dalda. The L in there is to represent the Unilever connection. And so it becomes this like major company. It's probably one of the largest first food conglomerates that we see in the subcontinent. And it's got this major sort of international presence, but it's not filtering through the center in Delhi. It's filtering through government in Punjab and eventually in UP. And because UP and Punjab are these separate entities that are meant to deal with their politics locally, they can't actually trade with each other. And so one of the first questions that comes up is like, well, how will UP and like how will the United Provinces and Punjab start to think about extra border trade, right? So then all of these formulations are concocted to think about selling dalda from a base in Punjab to the neighboring communities and, in just over the border in the United Provinces. And so you get this really interesting sort of moment where like all of a sudden the Raj is kind of being, is kind of being bracketed off as concerned with like the central dynamics of transnational trade. But here is low-level transnational trade that's happening around the center and in the provinces. And so like, again, this notion of, a salt tax as the primary sort of detractor from survival around a food substance, to me feels really, really simplistic. Though, I can see its importance in galvanizing this transnationally resonant event. It just doesn't square up with what I've been thinking about in terms of food history. And then so to move on from that very lengthy sort of context of economics, the other question is, does salt resonate? For the INC, it doesn't, right? Gandhi's ridiculed for making this an issue. It's the salt tax has been around for ages. And the protest doesn't eradicate the salt tax. The salt tax only eradicated in 1947 for good. And it's really just kind of rethought. So, the INC, this is not the focus of their agenda. Their agenda is much more highfalutin in terms of thinking about the formalization of politics and actually advocating for broad scale reformations of what it is to be, a citizen within the framework of empire. It's and Purna Swaraj, of course. It's not this kind of low level protest. And then, we have this Gandhian retort to all of that, which is, well, it's how I'm going to make, or it's how he's going to make the concerns of the rural really legible to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And I think that works for the rest of the world, but I don't know that it works for the rest of the country. And so for me, the notion of the event as being really grounded in the complexities of an Indian political nationalism seems, again, a little bit off. It's a big deal in the world, but is it a big deal at home? And then finally, the place where I think that we need to go with critiques of Gandhi and with critiques of the notions of universality that Gandhi deploys in the service of these large scale events within the history of nationalism is, does it resonate? Does it work? And whose nation is Gandhi really describing? So does the rural resonate? I don't know that it does. And this is one thing that I want to do in developing the paper is really try to look at Indian responses to the Salt March, which are, hopefully in the vernacular. I've got some of those sources I would love to hear about more that I can read the ones in Hindi and I can figure out help for the ones that aren't. And yeah, so does the rural resonate? What do Indians think about the struggle on the ground beyond Gandhi making a big deal of it? And then also, the Dalit critique, and this is I think maybe also another reason why the Salt March is so important, because if we think roundtables as the outcome, we can also think of the Pune Pact as the outcome, and Ambedkar's real emergence onto the scene as a major political player as the outcome as well. So the Dalit critique, something I've been dedicating as much time as I can to, is thinking about Dalit food histories and recovering traditions of eating and preparing and disseminating food that are not Savarna, or that are sort of extra Savarna. And I think there is a Dalit critique of food that's extant even at the time, written about at length by Ambedkar, who, for instance, writes a lot about ghee satyagrahas in places where ghee was not allowed to be used by Dalits. And so, I haven't found anything for salt, but I think the notion of a Dalit critique of food discourse is useful here. And of course, the Dalit critique of the universality of the Indian body, which is so steeped in a notion also of exclusion of certain kinds of bodies and certain kinds of subjects. And then I think there's a gender critique too, because it just strikes me with this, and I can't remember, I think is it Rebecca Parr, the paper on the visual, it was just so fantastic. I'm sorry, I can't remember the scholar's name at this point. The gender critique here is really important as well, because so much is made, especially at the Darshana Saltwerk protests, of the fact that, Gandhi was imprisoned just before and he couldn't go. And so Sarojini Naidu and this coterie of women lead the charge and then do the nursing. And so there's this whole dynamic around gender that happens at this point in the movement, when the ashram really is, I wouldn't call it a gender neutral space or even an equitable space, where women are playing a role, and they play a role in great ways in this protest, even though the men are the ones who are doing the charging and being hit down. So the gender critique is there. And then also, like, I think after, contending with the work of Vinay Lal and others now for 15 or 20 years, or however long it's been since that work came out, I think that talking about Gandhi without also talking about some of the ways in which different kinds of subjects are rendered marginal when we talk about his moral victories, right? And I'm thinking in particular about Brahmachari and the accusations and allegations and likely, I don't know, I guess following Vinay Lal, truths about the use of female bodies in helping Gandhi to test his morality around his celibacy. Like, I think that really needs bearing out when we think about Gandhi as leader, right? There are millions of subjects in the nation who are automatically sort of excluded from taking on those heroic roles, because they do serve this subservient other role. And I think, we've got women there as a category, Dalits more importantly there as a category. And then also, again, like, having spent 25 years studying South Asian history, from the mid 90s on to today, for me, the communal issue is always the central issue. And the notion of a nation always has to be complicated by the rife divisions around nationalism. And again, if we think of the roundtables as the big outcome of this moment of protest, nowhere shows this off better than the roundtable discussions, which really, really rigidifies some of the lines in the sand that the Congress and the League draw against each other. And then also sort of has this interesting, the first and third talk, sort of taking up of the princely states and those actors as important ones. So the communal question cuts so many ways, mostly Hindu Muslim, also sort of Savarna, Achut here. So it just seems to me like this notion of an embodied nation that's so legible to the world is so problematic on the ground in India. And for me, coming back to the first slide, the universal poor doesn't square with the middle class aspirational. And when we're talking about food in this period, that's really what we're talking about. So when I think about universalizing bodies in this moment, it's not through the rural uptake of salt on the ground, it's through the middle class aspirational mode of being able to go to the store and buy food that you help to prepare your meal at home. That's the image, that's the dream that's being sold. And that's the one that really resonates in bizarre economics at this time as well. So I think I just wanted to sort of give you context for where my paper is coming from, and what the nature of my challenge to, I guess, the broader theme of the SALT protest would be, from the perspective of, about thinking about bodies, thinking about what bodies mean, thinking about what bodies do, and thinking about the economic and political context of how food matters in this period. So I'm going to stop sharing and leave it at that.
Thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful, and also thank you for complicating the idea of looking at the Salt March for us and throwing open so many perspectives. So this is open for questions and observations. And let me sort of misuse my position here for having the, I'm just wondering, around the time in the 1930s, what are the kinds of, so you've talked about about dalda, which actually remained quite an important part of Indian cooking for, I think like till the 1980s, if I remember, like then sort of Indians go on to this health kind of this thing about health, and when they start sort of not using the vanaspati ghee, and they go on to what are the more healthy refined oils and so on. But I'm wondering what other kinds of information or other kinds of discourses are there on food. Like we've heard so much about like what Gandhi ate and what Gandhi did not eat. Like to some extent, sometimes I laugh about it when I talk to my friends that how much can we after all talk about how little he ate and how little he wore. So the fact is that, so what are the other kinds of discussions that now I'm also asking this because there's a surfeit of actually thinking about food, right? And you quite rightly pointed towards the idea of like this, the whole movement around Dalit food and, how little actually we know actually about Dalit food. But there's if you go to a store, there's a plethora of even historical cookbooks and so on, which are again referring to royal cooking and to Mathur cooking and this cooking. So, but I'm wondering, like in the 30s, what other kinds of conversations are happening around food, around scarcity, around so salt is only one part of it, as you point out, but in other ways, because let's say there's the whole green revolution that comes on after independence, and that sort of changes the way we're thinking about food. So what is happening in the 1930s?
Oh, thanks for that, Tanisha. It's a great question, and I'm like, yeah, this is so exciting. I can champion my book. So I hope Riho will also chime in, because I know that she's been working on this stuff a lot. So many conversations about food. So the conversation that's probably, Gandhi is certainly the most legible, because we have all of these like, why don't you try to only eat potatoes today, and then record what you poop and send it back to me and we'll talk. There's that whole thing that's going on around like a, really sort of austere way of thinking about the diet that's in relationship to the body, and he's trying to get everybody to go vegan and whatever. So there's that discourse that's really legible, almost global. Well, I don't know how global it is at that point, but certainly legible as the Gandhian way of thinking about food and invigorating the body, right? But I think the most dominant conversation is really about new food commodities. So things like vanaspati ghee, chai, chai and tea bags, right? So prepackaged chai is a huge topic. Another big area is baby formula. Like this is hugely and hotly debated, in part because Nestle injects tons of money into building up an Indian market. And then, yeah, I mean, like through the march of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, it's really the development of these kind of new food products that dominates in the public sphere, because that's where the money goes into advertising. And the work of people like Doug Haynes, Abby McGowan a little bit, I think say mostly Doug Haynes. He's done a ton of work on the history of advertising, also taking up Dalda, and looking again like at the transnational investments and thinking about India as a major sort of food consuming market of processed goods and new goods. So there's the middle class aspirational. I've done some work on, as has Charu Gupta and her students, on cookbooks. So this is the moment, and that has, I think, a lot to do with the reification of the family unit and the domestic sphere as being, really governable, right? Like it's not in sort of the pejorative use rather than connected to the state, but like the home is a place that you can really order along these new sort of almost like Protestant ethics of like economy and morality and progress and nationalism, and again in a much sort of coming from a different perspective, a kind of disciplining of the family into the unit that will make that will really root the nation. So there's all that as well. And then I think some of the lesser relevant or the lesser known discourses around food come from the conversations at the labs in Kunur. Projit Mukherjee has done some work on this, so I don't think it's out. There's this nutrition lab that starts in, I think, the 1910s, but really sort of comes to fruition a little bit later. In southern India and the Kunur labs, and they do things like measure the calorie, measure dietetics. There's a big link there to notions of race science and thinking about blood types and thinking about all of that. Of course, like we've got David Arnold here. There's so much work on beriberi, nutrition, disease, diabetes. Like these are also medical discourses that are percolating. So I think there are so many different ways of thinking about food discourse in this period that the Gandhian one, though it's in some ways the most legible, is really the least relevant because it's always just seen as the exception, or it always just becomes for me the exception, and thinking about the sort of the proliferation of different food discourses. But to move that on, I think the really interesting work here is Benjamin Siegel's in his amazing book. I think it came out last year, called Hungry Nation, and his big argument is that whereas in the pre-20th century, food is really, really private. Or it's not private, it's just not sort of relevant to politics in a way that's legible beyond sort of agricultural debates or the cultivation of new commodities. And then in the 20th century, you get these kinds of food discourses that are important. But in the 40s, with the Grow More Food campaigns of the sort of after the famines of the mid 40s and the Grow More Food campaigns in the 46, 47, Taylor Sherman's work is relevant here. You start to have food become, and feeding the nation become, a litmus test for the proto-post-colonial Nehruvian government. And so food becomes the question in the negotiation of a post-colonial governmentality for Nehru and others from 45, 46, all the way through the 50s, leading up to the Green Revolution. So food goes from being off the political agenda and legible in ways that are sort of pertinent to different modes of thinking about economy, different modes of thinking about popular culture, different modes of thinking about sort of governing the body through public health. But in the 40s, that all becomes the focus of government because feeding the country becomes, an early post-colonial goal. And I've done some work on other modes of post-colonial goal setting with the Bode report and notions of universal public health. Food doesn't sort of fall away in the same way that public health does. But yeah, it really finds its moment of fruition in the Green Revolution, followed by, after that, the neoliberal uptake of cultivating different kinds of nutrition and agricultural overproduction. So that becomes something else entirely in the 80s, 90s, and today. But yeah, it's that shift from a proliferation of discourses in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s into the universalizing of politics in the late 1940s. That for me is really the big shift in thinking about food and history in the early 20th century.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. That sounds like an incredible work. When is it coming out?
Mine?
Yeah.
Let's see when this pandemic ends.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
hopefully someday soon.
Yeah. So other questions or observations here?
If I, until the chat warms up a bit, can I come in? Thank you for a wonderful paper, really, really compelling and so provocative. And I think we could spend a long time discussing it, and looking forward to continuing to hear about it over the next few weeks down to the publication deadline. Yes. Just a couple of observations. Next week, we've got a paper on Kunur. So Ashok Malhotra is talking
Amazing.
about that
Can't
lab
wait.
and all the investigations that went on there. So we're really looking forward to that. The other issue is really just picking up your point right at the end there. It just strikes me as hugely ironic that the British, who were so preoccupied with the politics of food in their own country in the 19th century, the Corn Laws, food, you know, that was the stuff of political culture in the 1840s, and then again in the 1910s as they contemplated protection, should be so kind of blithe, should be so kind of nonchalant that food doesn't matter in an Indian national context. And I think your paper showed ways in which there's a real, you know, mismatch between what's going on and what's understood to be going on by the colonial authorities. So thank you. It was just an observation, really.
No, thanks for that, though. But I think that this, you know, the spectrum of Indian food is so vast. Like, how could it possibly be taken up in a cohesive way? Like, but of course, we do have, you know, these moments of agricultural history that are very much focused on the cultivation of certain crops and certain new food substances, and managing moments of scarcity with the cultivation of food. It just doesn't ever emerge in ways that have been evident to me as a major concern for empire. I would love to be wrong about that, though. So if anyone else has anything else to say, and I really kind of want to get Riho into this conversation, because her work on 19th century food cultures, for me, has made evident the deep complexities in the connection between food and the Mughal Empire and the post-Mughal period. Food as a way of thinking about commemorating the historicities of those cultures. And some of the most interesting work that I read of hers and her colleagues in Japan are about, you know, some of the uses of ghee and the debate in the major wars between palaus and biryanis and in the courts of you know, imperial Lucknow and Delhi. So there are all these like incredibly exciting food histories that are part of you know, pre-20th century history that are really relevant to state and political history. So just not Raj histories. And so I think it's important to sort of bring that perspective in as well.
The funny thing is that the Indian Twitter right now is abuzz with these discussions around biryanis and pulaus, because we just had an election in Hyderabad. And so one of the things was that how Hyderabad should be renamed, and the whole thing about like, what would you do then with the Hyderabadi biryani, or whether you'd call it, you know, Bhagyanagar Pulao or some such thing. So these conversations are very much alive, and there's,
Absolutely.
So if you can, so Martin Gorski, question asked from ignorance, is the politics of opium regulation worth introducing as a parallel or point of contrast to food discourses that you're discussing?
It's a really interesting question. Opium, I wouldn't say so much, but certainly one of the places where I start thinking about food regulation, because that's a lot of the work that I do now, is with the chemical examiners. And so it's not quite, it's like definitely not quite, you know, quite opium, but certainly thinking about like substances and how they harm. This is where it all comes from. And so some of the first food substances to be banned are actually in relation to poison. And this is, of course, work that David's doing and Mitra Sharafi and others. So not quite opium. That's a little bit too early for the period that I'm thinking about. But yeah, definitely other substances, adulteration, danger. This is where a lot of the discourses come from. I see another question here.
Yes, so it's, I mean, if you can read, it's there.
I mean, that's the question I've been asking myself all week. Does salt really qualify as food? I don't know if it does or it doesn't. I mean, I've sort of taken it up as food here because I think there's a way about talking about, you know, what substances do in the body that is most sort of grafted onto how we think about food, especially in this moment. So yeah, I don't know that advertising is the most important thing here at all. That's a problematic that I've been working with, and I think this is the question that I've been sitting with as I've been trying to work at this paper the last week. I don't really know if it necessarily is, but I don't also know that it necessarily isn't. And so for me, it's just the thing that really, that I was trying to get at, and I will sit with this and really rethink the connection to see if it's worth pursuing, is this notion that there's something that's so foregone about how bodies work, in a moment where that very question is being contested in all these different ways, in medical discourse and science discourses, and of course in food discourses. So I'm not quite sure. I think you might be right in calling me out in this particular way. But I'm not quite sure that it isn't food. So I think that's the best I can do. But yeah, I think that is the sort of the central problematic I'm trying to work around with this paper.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question about where do we actually place salt? Because when we're looking at, say, in the pre-colonial context, when we're looking at scarcities, there's like so much around scarcity of grain or other things, and they're writing about even bajra is not available and so on and so forth. But it never comes down to really salt, because of course, one is that salt seems to be available till it does not, till it is not. But there's a certain kind of idea of scarcity that is then built around the fact that unavailability of salt then renders a number of other kinds of foods difficult to so
yeah, for sure. I'm not, I mean, yeah, I guess that's for me one of the questions about what salt really is. And it's been really interesting reading the papers these past few weeks, because it's just not a place that we go, right? Like there's a sense that salt is a preservative agent, and that's of course importantly, incredibly important in thinking about like the history of food globally. And there's salt as substance, and then I was trying to rack my brain to remember exactly where like all of the Bengali contentions about like the salt come from. In like I've done a little bit of work on sort of food discourses in Bengali lit, because Tagore, of course, always with the food. But it just struck me that it's so much a part of how every bit of cooking is discussed, every bit of living is discussed in a way that's really, that's really vivid. But for me, it's less the food question rather than the cling to how a universality and how bodies work, when all of these and coming from that, how nations work. And so for me, it's really complicating that notion of embodiment that comes up with this notion that bodies work the same because they're Indian, and Indians deserve their own land because of it. And so, yeah, and I've also, I live in Canada, and I'm very influenced by sort of Indigenous studies here, and it's a fight that Indigenous scholars have with each other as well, thinking about sort of different territorialities and different modes of land and connections to the body. And so, yeah, that's where I think the push to sort of shake up the universality of embodiment comes from as well. So, not quite sure. I see one last question.
Yeah. So how far?
Yeah.
How far?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. So they're running. They're learning lots of. Oh yeah. Okay. Good. Let's see Germany too. So for the question about outside urban areas, absolutely, it's huge. So this is the story for Vanaspati is the one I know the best, and Doug Haynes has. He's tracked down like the reach and the plans for thinking about rural audiences. And so what Dalda did was they hired the commission of this kind of trucky van thing that they shaped in like a sort of like as if it was a can of Dalda, and they just drove it around the countryside in order to try to get on board rural markets. And one of the things that we see, and this comes from friends with backgrounds in the history of advertising, is that like Dalda becomes a commodity that everybody uses, so it's not sort of cordoned off in any way. Yeah, we see the majority of the advertising happen in ways that are consumable by folks who can go and consume newspapers or journals or articles, whatever, directly. But then, as Francesco Orsini and many others have argued, the limits of the public sphere are not always bounded by those who directly consume, but those who are part of the way in which discourse filters down. So I feel fairly comfortable. And this is, again, like thinking about the work of Doug, of Charu Gupta, of her students, of those who work really directly on popular culture. I feel pretty comfortable with the claim that advertising is definitely something that moves beyond the pages and those who read it into bigger spheres. But it's, of course, a really important question to keep in mind. What is Jerry asking me? Some of the women who are not in Bombay. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I think this is really interesting, right? Is like, and this is a question about women wanting to join who weren't there but joined it as symbolic. I think this is really interesting, and yeah, I love this as a rejoiner that sort of disproves the point I'm trying to make about the universality of bodies and the resonance of the protest. Oh, I mean, I hope that we hear more about these particular experiences. I know that we have a little bit in the paper about the visual impact of all of this, but yeah, but satyagraha as a symbolic act, regardless of salt, this is absolutely important. And I think, yeah, the emergence of different kinds of actors, especially young ones, especially women, into the movement in the 30s and especially the 40s during sort of those peak years of protest is vital as well. And finally, this question here about which languages they're running. I mean, we see print cultures in so many different languages. The ones I look at are in Hindi, but you can find, and sometimes Bengali, but you can find them in really all of the vernacular Indian languages. Print culture is the story in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I kind of feel like I better leave it there to move on to the next presenter.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I'd like to thank you here. Thanks a lot for this
thank you all
paper.
for your questions and for inviting me to participate.
And we look forward to reading the paper when it comes out as in the volume.